Hey Jimmy, how goes it? Good to see you. It's the Pootie checking in. How's my audio, bud? Just an introduction to solder work, which is the way that you join this kind of light gauge metal together. So I just wanted to look at it from the point of view of the absolute basics to get you going. 5x5, excellent. Thank you. All right, guys. Welcome to Metalsmith Shop. So today we are going to be looking at just the basics of soldering. I really just wanted to go over how we use solder to join this kind of light gauge metal together. There's going to be a little bit of theory today, but just hang in there, because if you can understand those the ideas behind the soldering, it's really going to improve the quality of your solder work. So the first thing we want to look at is prepping our workspace. Obviously, when you're using solder, you've got some pretty high heats involved. So you want to work in a place where it would be okay for a hot bit of solder to fall. It is quite hot. So, for example, a worst case scenario would be something like a shag rug. Anything, any surface that you wouldn't want somebody smoking over is a surface that's inappropriate for solder work. Best case scenarios would be something like cement or tile. The other thing is you want a surface that you're actually soldering onto that doesn't conduct heat very well. So for example, you don't want a metal plate to solder on. This is one of my favorite items to solder on. It's essentially compressed cardboard. It's got a similar feel to what you'd see on the back of a legal pad. And it does not, it'll burn a little bit, but it doesn't really catch fire. And obviously it acts as an insulator to keep the steel below from drawing off the heat from our solder joint. The next thing you want to think about is ventilation. Best case here would be to work outside, like say in a porch or something like that. But if you have to work in a shop, make sure that you have positive airflow, and you want to set it up where it's not blowing across your workspace, but essentially that the fan is drawing the fumes and things away from you. Believe it or not, a person is hot enough that they create kind of a rising air of column above your head. If you've ever sat next to a campfire and wonder why the smoke keeps following you around the campfire, that's one of the reasons. We're like a little light bulb sitting there heating up a column of air that's drawing air into us. So when you're soldering, it tends to want to pull it in, and especially when you're beginning and you're looking at detail, the first reaction is to lean into your work and just be right over your workspace, which essentially puts your face right in the fumes, and it's obviously something we want to avoid. So something like a small USB fan or something of that nature that can kind of draw those fumes away. I remember they used to have ashtrays for cigarettes that would actually suck the smoke in from the cigarette before it got going, and something similar to that idea would also be good. To give you an idea of how critical it is, at one point in my career, I was signing up to work for a semiconductor factory. And of course, we were going to be working with very, you know, heavy metals and things like that as part of that work. So to protect themselves from liability, they sent anyone who was interested in working for them out for a blood test. And I took the blood test, thought no big deal. But when I went in to go speak to the lady about coming on board, or I'm sorry, to the hospital to talk to them about the blood test, the nurse sat me down. The first thing she said was, "Do you do a lot of solder work?" And I was kind of taken aback. I was like, "What the? Like, how would she know that?" And I kind of said, "Yeah," and looked at her like a magician. And she said, "Yeah, it shows up in your blood work." And that was an eye-opener because I had never considered that the heavy metal mix that I'm using in soldering was being ingested into my body at such levels that it could actually show up in a test to a complete stranger. So don't take it lightly. Also, they are fumes. They are not. They're very, very fine particulates. So anything like a simple particle mask, like something you would use for painting or um, fine woodwork, is not going to be enough. You really need positive ventilation to get those fumes physically away from you while you're working. Okay. So the next thing you want to talk about is just kind of prep to actually doing the solder. Now, when you get a soldering gun, you're going to start with a brand new tip, and a lot of times those tips are covered by some kind of protective coating. Sometimes it almost looks like a chrome. Other times, more recently, I've noticed they actually use kind of a light solder layer, which is fantastic. But one of the first things you're going to have to do is what's called tinning the tip. So in other words, a soldering gun isn't necessarily ready for use right out of the box. So when you receive the soldering gun, you'll have a new tip, and this area right up here, if it looks super shiny or looks almost chrome plated, what you're going to want to do is rough up that surface. So take a light file and just kind of run it across the tip a few times to kind of break up that surface. And there's a natural bevel to the tip right here. So what you're going to do is just kind of run your file across it. You don't want to take a lot of material off the tip because of the way the heat works. The little blob of metal at the end of this tip is what actually kind of focuses the heat in this area. So you don't want to actually file down your tip, but you do want to rough up that surface. Once that surface is roughed up, you're going to put a little bit of tip cleaner or flux on it and go ahead and turn on your soldering gun and let it come up to temperature. You'll see it start to like smoke and burn off some of the flux. And once it does that, you can touch it to the solder. And what you want to do for the first time is just let a little bead of the solder melt onto the tip and then carefully set it down and let it cool. Okay? By doing that first, just setting of allowing the solder to essentially freeze back onto the tip, you're going to set up that tip to be able to work for you efficiently. It's going to let the heat flow from the tip into the material you're working with, so that that tinning of the tip becomes kind of the medium that the heat can propagate through into your tin. This is one little product I've found. It's just a little tiny tin, and it's actually called Tip Tinner, as you can see there. And this one is by a company called Thermaltronics, and they even have a website, thermaltronics.com. But if you search for like Tip Tinner on Amazon, I'm sure you could find it. And this one was interesting because essentially this gray area here, it's not just the flux, but it's actually essentially very, very fine solder. So you don't even need to get the solder to freeze it on. You just put it on here, liquefy this a little bit on the tip, let it cool, and the tip will be tinned for you. So that kind of gets us in the ballpark of being nerd. So what are the basics to soldering? Well, obviously you've got your solder, at least a 100-watt soldering gun. I do recommend a gun as opposed to a pencil, even the larger pencil styles. The reason is the larger pencil styles, first off, tend to not be strong enough. They run generally in the 75 watt and less range. And it's important to understand the wattage. The wattage for soldering guns is like horsepower for engines. It's a measure of how much power the item you have is able to put out. Okay, so here's what can happen, and was the interesting thing about a soldering gun. Hey, Journeyman, good to see you, bud. Is with any soldering gun, obviously, it puts out enough energy to melt solder. I mean, that's the whole point of the soldering gun, right? But what we have to keep in mind is a lot of soldering applications, especially today, are very, very fine. They're for things like working on electronic circuit boards and stuff like that. And if I tried to work on an electronic circuit board with this, I would roast every single component I was trying to put in, no matter how careful I was trying to be. Because the sheer amount of heat that this puts out would actually damage the components that I was trying to install. By the same token, using those small soldering devices that are meant for those circuit boards is going to leave you in this very strange place where you're melting the solder. You can see that the solder is melting, but when you bring it over to the tin or the other sheet metal that you're working on, you're not getting anywhere. The solder is just freezing, and you're getting what's called a cold solder, which means it's not actually gripping onto the material below, which is a very frustrating place to be in. And the other issue with that pencil style is that it's always on. Once you plug it in, it's on and it's hot. And the truth is, in the way we do tin work or sheet metal work, we're going to be putting that thing down and then turning it on for short periods and then putting it down again, letting it cool. And which is also very healthy for the soldering implement. You can take a brand new soldering gun and you can burn right through a brand new tip in a matter of 5 minutes. And you can completely burn out a gun in 10 minutes by just sitting there and holding the trigger down. Soldering guns, like welders, have what's called a duty cycle, which essentially means it's not meant to just be plugged in and run. It's supposed to have a period of time that it's operating and a period of time that it's cooling. If for some reason you have to do a lot of soldering, one of the things I recommend is buy multiple guns, so essentially one is sitting off in the corner and cooling while the other one's operating, and then as soon as you feel that one warming up, you just switch it out and go to the other gun, let the other one cool off in the meantime. But for most folks, you're never going to be doing that kind of volume soldering for creating your artwork. And so, I just noticed, got a broken light bulb there. And so one soldering gun should be plenty for the kind of work you're going to be doing. So in this case, this soldering gun is rated at 260 watts and 200 watts. So a 200 watts is essentially low, 260 is high. Again, you don't need anything that high to begin with. Generally, if you get anything in the range of, like, say, 100/150, which is kind of the lower end guns, that will be enough to do most of what you're going to run into. Okay, so that's the first component, the soldering gun. The next component is the solder itself. It tends to come in spools. These are sold at electrical supply stores and also at Lowe's and Home Depot. Journeyman, I saw you have a question that said, what about the instant heat ones that came out a few years back? Those ones tended, again, it's a great question. They can definitely melt solder. They're capable of doing that, but their total heat output isn't enough to heat another large piece of metal. And we'll get into the physics of why that's so. So they're perfectly fine for things like an on-road repair of automotive wiring or component level repair on a circuit board. They're perfect for that. But once you move up to sheet metal, you're really demanding more in the way of total output. So, but great question. Thanks for that. So this is the solder. It tends to come in spools. This is about a 1 pound spool. Now, some of the metals that are in solder have really increased in value. So, I mean, a spool of solder not too long ago was like $7, and now it's much closer to like $16 to $18 for one spool of solder. So this is definitely one of the consumables you want to watch out for. So let's talk about flux next. So flux is a material that we're going to use to help etch the metal. So this is going to help the solder attach to the metal. It also helps the solder flow, which helps us get a really strong joint because we need that solder to flow into tight spaces as we're going to be sandwiching the metal together and then joining it in that fashion. So this is flux. Now flux comes in a number of different forms. First off, there's different formulas, but also they come as either a paste or a gel or a liquid. I prefer a gel because it stays attached to whatever you put it to, so you can work, at angles without it rolling off. But once you heat it up, it pretty much liquefies, which makes it very easy for cleanup afterwards. You don't want to leave any flux remaining on your piece after you connect it together because the way that the flux etches the metal is that it is an acid. Okay, and so if you leave it on your metal, that will be the first place that the metal starts to corrode. It may take years for it to do that, but of course, if you're creating artwork from scratch, you want it to be able to stick around for a while. So I see my father Toby's in the room as a moderator and just saying hi to you. Thanks for joining us. So that covers the basic components that we're going to be using. I already spoke about what to look for in a soldering gun. So I'm going to put that aside. And we're going to go back and talk in detail about the solder itself, okay? So solder is an alloy, okay? When you talk about metals, you can either have a single homogeneous metal. So when you talk about, for example, copper or iron or tin, that if you slice it and you look at any of the atoms within it, for the most part, you're looking at an iron atom or you're looking at a tin atom. The point of solder is to allow a metal to melt at a lower temperature than the metal that it's going to be joining together. And this is valuable because it allows us to create in a way where the metal that we're making will remain intact and we're just using the solder to join it together. So the solder is what's called an alloy, which means it's essentially like a mix. And if you think of a cake batter, once you mix in the flour, the sugar, a little bit of salt, and a couple eggs, once you blend those, if you were to look at any portion of that batter, you would not be able to find egg or flour or sugar because it is now mixed into a homogeneous mass. And that is what an alloy is in metals. And alloys are very particular because metals are very particular on an atomic level of how they like to be joined together. And it's actually incredible how much you can affect the characteristics of metal by playing with that idea of percentages. And to give a great example, if you look at aluminum, aluminum is quite soft as a natural metal in its natural state when you find it. But when you start to alloy it, okay, when you start to blend in small percentages of other metals, you change its characteristics in its formability, in its total strength, in its yield strength. So you're really changing the characteristics of that metal. And some of the advances in aluminum were really key to our modern jet aircraft age. Aviation is one of the places that, and aerospace for that matter, the space industry is one of those places that has really been able to arise due to our ability to create these alloys. And what's really interesting is when we talk about, blends of metals, it's not like 50-50 or 45-65. It is very, very fine percentages. So maybe the entire amount of alloying metals added to the aluminum might be, say, 7% of the total. So you've got 93% aluminum And then you've got 7% of other metals, and those metals are in hugely particular amounts. So it might be 2% of this, 3% of that, 5% of that. And then that's what you'll do to get all these different characteristics out of a particular aluminum alloy. In the case of solder, it's actually sold in a proportion of 100, okay? And that is an indication of its particular alloy, okay? So you'll see things like 50-50. You'll see 45-65, 70-30, 95-5 is one of the newest ones. There are a bunch of new solders on the market that are trying to get away from the basic solders that have been out of there for some time. So I see Jimmy has a question about the solder that I use and whether it's lead-free. And while I would prefer lead-free, Jimmy, actually the solder I use does still contain lead, and that is because the particular metal I'm using, this tin, has a lead component in it, and so it means that this solder with the lead in it joins very, very well. It flows smoothly, and it joins very strong. I have tried other modern solders to try to move away from that, and so far I haven't found one that works, but I'll continue to look into that, and certainly if I find it, I will be sharing it here so that all of us can benefit from that. Solders are very particular to the metals they're made for. So for example, a solder that is sold for copper is meant for copper and will not work with tin and probably won't work with brass. So it's very important when you go out for the first time to try solders that are available, things like that. Get a test spool first, especially at 16, 18 bucks a spool. Try it out, and whatever you do, don't go by whatever the guy in the big box store tells you is the right solder, because most of the time he's selling to someone who's soldering copper pipe, okay? And so no matter what he swears works and what has worked for his customers aren't necessarily working with the same materials you are, and it can change what is working. That goes for the flux as well. If you're having issues with how the flux performs, you may want to play with the particular flux product that you're using. So getting back to the proportions, they're generally in what we talked about is a proportion of 100, so 50-50, 70-30, and so on. Another thing that will differentiate solder when it's sold, and you'll see that listed on here. So I don't know if that'll come into focus, but right here it indicates 50-50 on this particular spool. But another thing that you'll run into is the idea of a core. So you'll have a solid core, an acid core, and a rosin core. And core is referring to the solder being like a hollowed out tube. So if we imagine this as a cross section of the spool of solder, what they do is they figure, well, you know, every time you go to solder, you're going to want some flux. And so why don't we just include the flux in the solder? Okay. And okay, so this is where we're at. Okay, now if you imagine this is the solder. Okay, this is this up close. All right, it can be sold. Oh, I'm sorry that this is backwards in the image. Unfortunately, I'm on the back side of things. So until I learn how to write backwards, you guys are just going to have to translate. So it can be sold with a center hollowed out. Imagine like a Twinkie, right? And here's your filling. So what they do is they sell it with flux inside the solder itself, okay? And you can have either a rosin core, an acid core, or a solid core, okay? A rosin core is used for electronics, and that's because the rosin has very, very little acidity. So that way, if just a little bit of rosin is left over or doesn't get cleaned up as part of the process, it won't actually start eating away at your electric components or at the circuit board and the circuitry. An acid core is used for more heavy metal work in order to actually prep the metal to really hold on to the solder. So acid core gives you the benefit of a much stronger joint and much better cleaning action. And then finally, a solid core deletes this, and it just ends up being solder all the way across this cross section. Okay. So as tinsmiths, the one that we're going to prefer to use is the solid core. And I just want you to know what the options are out there so that when somebody says, oh, we've got some, some solder right here, it's 50-50 acid core, you'll be able to intelligently know what they're trying to sell you and what you need or what you don't need. Reason being is there are times when you just need solder in some place or heat, and times when you need flux. So you really want to control where and when the flux is going to go down and be used in your project. Okay. So let's look at how we actually want to use the solder in our work. Now, a lot of times when people start first working around the soldering, the first thing that's very intimidating is the heat. So they tend to work quickly, like they're trying to get it over with. And that's a mistake. You really want to take your time with this and let the heat propagate through the metal. A lot of people will think of it because you're melting the metal and then applying it to the metal, it cools and then it sticks. And they relate that cycle to a hot glue gun. And that is a mistake. Solder does not work the same way as hot glue. Solder, you have to prep in a very particular way. And also, solder, if you just drop it on liquid and let it cool without any prep and without heating the surfaces that you're going to connect, you'll end up with what's called a cold solder. And a cold solder can be very dangerous because a cold solder can look like it's a proper strong solder, but actually have no strength whatsoever to actually hold or retain a clip or a hanger or something of that nature. And so what it means is it could go out of the shop looking just fine, customer buys it, takes it and hangs it in their house, and then somewhere along the way, the mirror just drops off the wall, which obviously is something we want to avoid. So there are three basic joints when we talk about how to join two pieces of metal. Now, what I'm drawing is essentially, imagine a cut through on the side of two pieces of metal being joined together. Unfortunately, oh great, I forgot, this is backwards. This is called a butt joint. So essentially what it is the two pieces of metal come in together, they meet on the end, and then this is where you would be applying whatever is actually joining the metal together. When we talk about this joint, what we're looking at here is obviously you have a smooth surface when you're finished, but you have very little strength, okay? Because when we go to use solder, what you find is that the solder itself is not very strong. It's one of the results of it being able to melt at such a low temperature. So a butt joint like this, although clean, is not very strong at all and not preferable. So the next step up from a butt joint is a T-joint. So in a T-joint, we have a layer of metal down here, and we have a layer of metal coming in straight into it here. Okay? A T-joint, and then what had ended up happening, if we imagine that this is our solder, is people will come in and they'll kind of, put a bead of solder on this side, a bead of solder on this side, and feel like, okay, that's pretty strong. Okay? A T-joint is somewhat stronger than a butt joint because at least you've got a little more surface area in contact, but it's only marginally stronger. And again, we do have to use it sometimes, but you certainly don't want to use it in places that are going to be structurally critical to your piece. Okay? The final joint is the one that we prefer. I see Jimmy was asking about a particular heat range. Jimmy, to be perfectly honest, I've always just used these Weller soldering guns, and obviously they're tuned already to handle solder, and they just have a low and a high. So I don't have a real sense of what exact temperature they're working at, but I will look that up because I think it's valuable information. It's something we should be able to share in. So the final joint, and this is the joint that we actually want to be using as tinsmiths or as metalsmiths, is a lap joint. And a lap joint means that we're actually going to lay one piece over the other to create a sandwiched area, okay? And then we are going to actually look to solder in this area here. And this is a very important point because of the fact that the solder is relatively weak. The only strength in our joint occurs in this overlapped area that contains joining solder in it, okay? It's a very important concept because you will see people that do essentially this, okay? They will glom on a huge pile of solder. Most of it ends up over the piece, almost as if it's kind of like a hook holding onto it. And if you had these two pieces and you ripped them apart, I guarantee you that they would break on exactly this line right here, and all of this solder would remain, and all you would see, and this solder would go with this piece. And what that tells you is that this area here, is not critical to the strength of the solder joint. Only this part here is critical to the solder joint. So that is our preferred joint, the lap joint. Okay, so the next topic we want to talk about is heat propagation, okay? What am I talking about there? If I've got a piece of metal, and I want to heat it up and join it with solder, what I want to do is start by cleaning the surface. So if there's any rust or any corrosion, you want to remove that. A very good product for that would be something like steel wool. I use quadruple aught steel wool. It's something that you can get in the paint department of the big box stores, things like that. And you're just simply going to scratch the surface, okay? So if we were to look at the surface very, very closely, when we hit it with the steel wool, essentially we're scratching it. We're creating little points and valleys in the surface of our metal, okay? Our next step is to apply our flux, which we talked about you can find as either a paste, a gel, or a liquid. And so we're literally going to use a brush and kind of paint flux into here, okay? Remember that flux acts as an acid etch, okay? So, okay, it acts as a metal etch, an acid etch in there. And essentially what that does is, if you were looking again microscopically at the material very close, and you had these little teeth that you scratched in with your steel wool, then the acid etch is going to turn those into shark teeth. It's going to actually create little etching scratches and ridges and stuff into those teeth, okay? This is preparing for the solder to grab into this area. It's going to be able to lock in like a fir tree into those grooves and really make for a strong joint, okay? So, how does heat work in this system? We're going to come in with our soldering gun tip, okay? And the tip is going to have heat in it, okay? And it's going to have liquid solder. And when you touch this metal, and the flux is going to immediately liquefy, and the solder is going to tend to want to follow where that liquefied flux is, okay? So it's just going to glom on here. And here is the critical point for good quality solder work, is that you need to keep the tip of the soldering gun in contact with both pieces of metal, okay, with pressure. Because what you're actually doing is allowing the heat in the tip to work into the metal. And this is very important, because in order to have a proper, strong solder joint, you need to raise the temperature of the tin to the temperature required for the tin to melt the solder. That's a very, very important idea. You can't just drop liquid solder on here, watch it flow, withdraw your heat, and then expect to have a good, strong solder joint. Now, here's the issue, and this is why it's important to have a soldering gun of a proper rating, is that these two pieces of metal conduct heat very, very well, okay? Any metal does. So essentially, a big flat piece of metal is actually a giant heat sink. In other words, it's constantly working to draw that heat away from a high heat source and to radiate it back out into the surrounding air out here, okay? And this is where the wattage of your gun becomes critical, because you need to get ahead of that process. You need to heat this area up so quickly that it can retain the heat, get up to a temperature required to melt the solder, and actually pull that solder in, okay? Now what's going to happen once you do that, you can actually see this happen. You'll put in a blob of solder here, okay? You'll start heating this metal, and you'll just leave the soldering gun tip in place to heat that metal. And once this comes up to temperature, because this is a sandwich, it will actually draw the liquid solder in through capillary action, okay? Now, it'll get about halfway in, and then what we're going to do is, once you see that happen, while still remaining in contact with your soldering tip, you're going to run that soldering tip slowly over the top surface of the tin. And when people see that, they say, well, I thought you just said that the tin doesn't do anything on the top surface. It doesn't. You're not trying to tin the top surface. What you're trying to do is propagate the heat along this metal, because as that heat travels down, it is going to continue to draw the solder further and further in until you fill that entire lap joint, okay? So what we're talking about is using the heat propagation on the soldering tip itself to actually draw the solder into the joint to have a nice, strong solder joint, okay? Okay, so let's look at some of our materials. I've got a little bit of a tin plate here. And let's just look at a basic prep for putting down some solder, okay? We're going to start with our steel wool. We've got our tin here. We've got a little rough spot here. And I'm just going to take the steel wool and just kind of rub it, just kind of rough up that finish there. I'm going to take a little bit of my flux. You'll see I've got a little tin of flux here in a gel form. I'm just going to use a simple little brush here and grab a little bit of that gel and apply it to my surface. Okay. Does not have to go on thick because it does liquefy. I'll bring my spool over and kind of pull it out here. And then I'll start warming up my gun. And wait for it to come up to temperature. Now these soldering guns, the heavy duty ones, they'll have two speeds, essentially high and low, and that's controlled by this trigger. So as I pull it back, and you'll actually feel it vibrate in your hand as you're working it, but as you pull it back, right there, that is high, and then it'll actually have a neutral, and then all the way back it'll click to low, okay? So I'm keeping on a high right now just to get it warmed up. You can see a little bit of smoke on the tip here. I'm just going to touch that to the top of my solder, kind of pushing it down, because as soon as it melts it, you'll see it's got a little bit of bead on the tip of that solder. It's a little too close. So it's got a little bead of liquid solder on the tip there. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to apply it, and watch, I'm just going to intentionally hold it in place. You can see a little bit of fumes raising up there. I'm going to hold it in place for a moment. Right now, I'm actually watching as it liquefies, so the heat is propagating out through the metal. As it goes a little further, I'm going to slowly kind of work out, and what I want you to see is how the solder is actually following the tip. So wherever I go with this tip, the solder is now attaching to the tin. I'm going to go to center with the heat on and slowly lift up, and I get a nice clean finish to my solder. Okay. You can see here the flux liquefied, so I'm just cleaning that up real quick with a rag. As soon as it cools down, you can take a little towel and just kind of absorb that. Okay, so obviously just having some solder on some tin doesn't join anything. It doesn't help us out in any way. So we need to talk about, well, how are we actually going to join something together? Okay, so let's take a small tab, and we're going to prep it. So we're going to hit steel wool on both sides. So, David, on the junior high flashbacks, was it due to the chemistry stuff, like talking about the atomic alloys and heat propagation through a material, or was it just being in shop class? What was your experience in junior high with that? So, so now you can see I've hit steel wool here. I've hit steel wool here. I'm going to apply a little bit of flux to my tab, like so. Again, we don't have to get too far carried away with it. I'm going to put this guy down on the piece of metal, and then I'm going to use this handy dandy guy. This is just simply an ice pick or something of that method, and I'm going to use it to hold the piece in place, okay? Night, my beauty, I love you. Night, night. So I'm going to hold this in place here. Okay. This is what I like to call my chicken stick, because I'm certainly not going to keep my fingers there. So when I was originally apprenticed to my grandmother, one time I was doing, in order to kind of qualify with her to be able to do candlesticks, I had to make a baker's dozen of them. And then she was going to go through at the end of the week and decide which ones she could keep and which ones were going to leave. And in the rush to do that, at some point, I ended up soldering a piece where effectively my finger was on one side and I ended up with the soldering gun tip on the other. And I will tell you from experience that it was as if there was nothing in between. It was literally just like putting the soldering tip to my finger. And it's quite a lesson. You don't ever do that one again. Or you move on to something that's friendlier to you, like, you know, paper mache, pottery, that kind of thing. All right, so let's hold this in place. Now what I'm going to do, remember that in the diagram I talked about trying to get heat to both pieces. So I'm actually going to try to bring the initial solder to the corner here, and just hold it in place. Okay. And then I'll see where the heat starts to draw that in, and as it does that, then now I'm going to start with that motion, so that we end up in a place where now I'm going to take solder, I'm going to liquefy it here, let it come up to temperature, and once it does start to draw through, then I will just push it up on the tab, and I can see where the solder is being pulled under this tab and through. Okay. So I'm going to try and rotate this. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but you might actually be able to see it spattering. If you watch in this area under the tab, I'm going to work from this side, and let's see if you can see some of that heat propagate through there. So I'm on the edge, waiting for this to come up to temperature. Okay, that's pretty good. Again, I'm going to go ahead and clean up some of that extra spatter right now. Now that it's warm and liquefied, it's a great time to kind of clean that up, and we have our piece attached. Now, while we're here, this is a great time to look at. I'm just going to take an unprepared piece of tin here. I want to take some of the liquid solder, and I'm just going to let it fall onto the piece there, okay? So, if you look right here, here is the tab we just attached, okay? This is a liquid piece of solder that just fell into an area that was not prepped in any way, okay? So we didn't scratch it with the steel wool. We did not apply any flux here, okay? And we're going to wait for these to cool, and we're going to take a look at the difference in strength between these two items here. So let me see if I can find a small punch. I think this is cooled. Okay, well, there you go. I hope you can see that because it happened so quickly. Basically, I just touched this punch to the side of it, and it just dropped right off. Literally no strength whatsoever. If we look at the back of this, you're going to see this is the drop of solder that fell off. It's almost like a mirror finish, right? In other words, there was just nothing for this to grab to. So that is a great example of a cold solder. It is solder. It was molten, but it had no actual strength, okay? Now let's see about this. This small tab can hold up the rest of this piece, no problem, first off. But let's take it to failure and see what kind of strength is required to get it to fail. So I'm going to take this tab, and I'm going to yank on it. Okay, so now we're going to get some twisting force in here, see if we can get a little bit of leverage. There we go. There we go. All right, so as you can see, it's actually deformed the metal. So this small little area under 1 inch square is enough solder, when prepared properly and done right, to create a joint that was so strong that I actually had to bend the metal around it just to pull that piece off. Now, if I hadn't used the heat propagation properly, what you would not have seen is a perfect little square here. Okay, so if you look at this square, this is that entire tab, but I was only working from one side. So the only way solder got in here is by using proper technique to use heat propagation and capillary action to draw that solder completely underneath that tab. Another thing I want you to notice, if you can see here, I don't know if it's going to show in the detail, but there's an actual ridge line here where there was excess solder around the perimeter. And you notice that stayed. In fact, it broke off in a clean line that's exactly equivalent to the shape of the tab itself. And again, that reinforces the idea that you can pile on all the solder you want around and above the tab. It does nothing to the strength itself. The only strength is in this area here where it was overlapped and where solder flowed into with proper preparation. So that would make for a great solder joint right there. In fact, I trapped my poor needle nose here, so we got to free him. Look at that. So that's what I had to do to that poor tab to get him away from there. When you're first beginning, and if you want to practice this and kind of look at your tabs to see if you've got good technique, if you see what looks like bubbles, those are air pockets where you did not get enough heat or enough solder to flow and get your solder all the way in. So you do not want little air bubbles or pockets in there, because that will minimize the strength of your tab. One of the things that's kind of a handy item for helping out when you're doing solder work, especially when you want to protect a piece, like let's say this was a piece of glass that I was soldering a frame on the corner, is just little pieces of tin like this, okay? This is just the shiny flashing, and you can actually slide this into a corner and it will protect the glass and give not only heat protection but also just spatter protection to the glass. So I recommend having some shapes like this, different sizes and shapes that you can slip into corners to protect your piece. Okay, so let's put what we just learned into practice. I've got a piece that I've already completed here. This is going to be a tissue box cover for one of the small style tissue boxes, and we're going to solder this together. So what I've got at the corner is a lap joint. I've actually bent and cut a tab right there. You can see a little 90-degree tab there, so that this overlaps one piece over the other, okay? So that this becomes our solder area, basically. So the first thing I'm going to do is hit it with the steel wool to prep it. Prep the back side. And then I'm going to apply some flux down into this area here, where I want the solder to flow. And then there's a very important concept. What I'm going to do is I'm looking right here at the corner, and I'm going to make sure that they align at the corner here. Let's see. Oh yeah, David. I mean, this makes you have so much more fine control with an electric soldering gun, and the key is that these heavy-duty guns that run in, like I said, 150 watt and up range, they put out so much heat that they're almost effectively like a torch. They're putting out that kind of heat. So, so yeah, it's really great to be able to use them like this. So this is a very important concept, and the concept is, it's called tacking. And welders will use this all the time, okay? Imagine you're trying to put together a section of a bridge together, and you're trying to line up two huge pieces of steel. So what you want to do as a welder is not have to hold that entire joint together as you're working along it. What you're going to do is you're going to tack it. You're going to go along the length of it and essentially weld little tiny points along the length to hold it in alignment. This allows you to, A, not have to hold the whole piece as you're welding along the way, but also B, be able to stop, put down your work, and look at the alignment and the structure to make sure it's what you really want to commit to and solder. So we do the same thing in tin work. I'm just going to start with a small tack right down here in this area. Again, I've prepped it. I hit it with the steel wool. I've applied flux. Now I'm going to warm up my soldering gun, pick up a little bit of liquid solder, bring it to this corner, and for right now, I'm just going to hold it into place and watch for it to flow. Once it flows, I'll lift away, I'll let it cool down, and that is my tack. Okay, so what I'm going to do is pause at this point, let it cool and strengthen, which it's already done. So you can see now it's holding itself. And now I'm just going to look and make sure everything's in alignment the way I want it before I commit to soldering all the way down this thing. Okay, everything looks good here. I'm going to go to the other side and get my little chicken stick and compress that lap joint. We want that as tight as possible. Don't worry about having space for that solder to draw in. Once it's liquefied, it could literally be a layer, you know, a few atoms thick, and it'll draw in and under into that space, and that actually makes for quite strong joint. So you don't want a thick gap like a sandwich where you've got all this filling in between. You want a fairly small space in there. The other thing you can do is you can stitch, okay? So if it's not absolutely required to go all the way down the length of a piece structurally to solder, then you can always stitch. So right here, I'm just going to start at the top. I'm going to let it come up to temperature. I'm holding it in place, and then I'm just going to slowly move down along that seam, still holding pressure down to keep it nice and tight, and just kind of draw that solder out. You'll see it can go quite far. And once it stops, I'll lift up. Okay, and we've applied solder all through this, let's see, this area here, right here. Okay, so we still need to do this area here. So I'm going to flip it over, come at it from the other side. Notice that I'm holding it in diamond form at a 45. That's because once the solder liquefies, it is affected by gravity. So we can actually use gravity to kind of pull that solder down into that joint and help it flow in and around that corner there. So again, I already applied flux to this area, so I'm just heating this up again. Now, we could stitch, so we could actually just go part way down this and just go in the middle and then just apply like a little 1-inch area of solder. We've already tacked the end, so the point of stitching is that you don't necessarily have to run solder down the whole length of an object to have a strong joint, especially if you've left a properly sized lap joint. Okay, so that gives us our nice box structure. And now we're going to put on a lid. So I've already made a lid here. I formed it, and it's going to pop right over the top here. It's a little tight, but that's okay. I like a good fit here. And again, with this one, I don't have to seam this whole thing. Actually, I've found that if I just find 2 corners and do a very good job of soldering those 2 corners, that will be plenty to hold this shape in place. So I'm looking down in the box, down into that corner right in here. I'm going to have to hold it down at an angle because, again, I'm going to use gravity to help flow that solder into that space. One of the things I've noticed that the students run into is, remember I said try to keep your head back from your work. I mean, in this case right here, this is essentially a little tunnel where the smoke's going up, or the fumes. So if I'm in here trying to look at the detail because I don't have enough light, then I'm putting my face right in that solder. So make sure you have enough light that you can sit back from your work and work from a distance so the fumes aren't right in your face there. Okay. Now if you look at my spool, I've already kind of burned down that line of solder, so I'm going to actually extend this out. Because the spools are plastic, you don't want to get the tip into that because then you've got a whole other series of fumes and smells you've got to deal with. Okay, again, bringing that heat into the tin and the joint in the corner. I'm just holding it in place with the soldering gun on, letting that heat propagate into the metal, and then as soon as I see flow, I slowly move that heat along my joint, and that action draws the solder along with it and into my spaces to create a beautiful little sandwich there, which equates to strength in my soldering joint. Okay, so there's our lid. And that is a beautiful New Mexico style tissue box. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Metalsmith shop. I enjoyed talking about solder. I think it's really important to have quality in your solder work. Um, it's more about the craftsman part than it is about the art. It's about creating something strong and something that's going to last. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Please share with your friends. And remember that if you want to get notified of when these are going on, you also need to click on that bell to get the notifications. I appreciate you checking in. And this is Jason Eunice with Metalsmith Shop. Thank you.